Buddhism and the God particle is, it was only a few weeks ago, wasn't it? Maybe a couple of months ago, that there was headlines about a new fundamental particle, the God particle, being discovered, the Higgs boson being discovered at CERN. And even the popular media was suddenly interested in the esoteric world of quantum physics, and this mysterious magical thing had been created in this huge, Large Hadron Collider, and somehow it was going to explain the meaning of everything. And so some wag had termed it the God particle. And it's not called the God particle, it's the Higgs boson. And Mr. Higgs, Professor Higgs, is still alive and will hopefully be receiving a Nobel Prize for having predicted that this thing existed. But I think it's not just sort of witticism that it was termed the God particle. I think there's, in the irony of calling it the God particle, there's some sort of something a bit more meaningful, because physics is trying to get to the core of what's going on, ultimately going on, and hoping that if it can understand these tiny fundamental things that make up matter, that will explain everything, and sort of take the place of what religion used to be used for. And these days, in a lot of ways, science and religion seem very distant. They seem like they're two different sort of schools of inquiry going in different directions. But actually they don't have to be. They don't have to be. So let me just read you something that Einstein said. Einstein, of course, he's not just one of the geniuses of the last century, he's probably one of the greatest thinkers ever, and certainly one of the greatest physicists ever. And that's not his only virtue, he was also very, very quotable. So he has lots of things that are very easy to pick out, and possibly sort of distort, but nevertheless he's very, very quotable. And one of the things he said was that the most beautiful thing that we can experience is the mysterious. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and all science. And then he goes on to say, and he always uses he because it was the early 20th century, he to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed. So I really like that, because there he was, one of the greatest physicists who come up with this theory of space and time. He was one of the grandfathers of quantum physics, which tries to explain what matter is. His attitude to the world was one of wonder and awe. Rather than thinking that he understood everything, he was somebody that was very humble in the face of reality. And not only that, but he says that if we can't stand wrapped in awe, if we can't wonder, then we're as good as dead, because our eyes are closed. And I really, really like that, because in our current age, with its technological, progress and powers, etc., it's very easy to lose sight of this sense of wonder. We can very, very easily think that we're in control. We kind of know what the world is, and we can manipulate that world if we have the right gadgets. If we have the latest iPad, it's all at our fingertips. And what we can easily lose in that is this sense of awe and wonder. And I think sometimes we have to step outside of this urban technological world in order to realize and feel this sense of humility in the face of something enormous, in the face of something mysterious. Buddhism, for me, helps me stay in touch with that sense of wonder, because as you progress along the Buddhist path, just as you progress along the scientific path as a physicist, actually the world becomes more mysterious. It's almost as if the more you learn, the less you know. The further you go, the more mysterious things are. You might start off thinking you understand what life is, what the world is, and you start to meditate, and you go on retreat, and you learn about Buddhism, and you look at your experience more closely, and particularly your mind, and you realise you don't really know what's going on. Similarly, as a physicist, if you start to explore things like matter, and you think, oh yes, this is all very understandable, and you look more deeply and you look more closely, as physicists over the last couple of hundred years have done, it all starts to become more and more elusive, incredibly elusive. Einstein, another thing he said is that common sense is not a guide. I mean, this is me paraphrasing. Common sense is not a guide to reality. In fact, he said that common sense is nothing more than the deposit of prejudices laid down in a human being by the time that he reached 18. He was sort of saying that we do not know what's going on, and if we're just guided by our 5 physical senses and by common sense reason, then we've got it very wrong. We're very deluded. And the Buddha was sort of saying something similar. He was saying that we human beings, we unenlightened human beings, have got it very wrong. We do not understand what reality is. We've got it very, very wrong. Now, he didn't understand quantum physics or physics at all. He was primarily talking about the mind. And what he was saying is that we, by not understanding things, cause ourselves suffering. We cause ourselves and those around us unnecessary suffering. There is suffering in the world, and some of it is unavoidable, but we add to that. We add to that through our delusion, through not seeing things as they really are. Physics has a different concern, but I find it interesting that physics is also saying we do not know what's going on. Yeah? What's going on at all. Now, sometimes physics doesn't. When you watch, I was watching a Horizon program last week. I don't know if anybody saw it. Something about how small is the universe. You can hear physicists talking as if they're just on the brink of understanding everything. That, they've got it all almost sewn up. But when you actually look at what they're saying, you realise that that's far, far, far from true. So I just want to explore some of the weirdness of modern physics, just touch on it, to show you that our common sense assumptions don't hold when it comes to looking at ultimate reality, as physics tries to do. Yeah? They don't hold at all. So for example, quantum physics is the study of the very, very small, the atomic and the subatomic levels. And atoms are tiny. I mean, they are so small that they're unimaginably small. So I was reading somewhere that in a grain of sugar, and I think it would be a sort of grain of brown Demerara sugar, sort of cube of sugar, tiny thing, there are, well, how many atoms do you think there might be? How many atoms? Don't say one. That's a clue. How many atoms do you think there might be? Yeah, that's a start. Several's good.
Like a billion?
A billion, did you say?
Well,
who said that?
I said.
Oh yes, a billion. So let's write up. Let's write a billion. So a billion is like, what is it? 1,000 million, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, 1,000 million is a billion, I think. Any other guesses?
2,000.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, 2,000 billion.
Trillion.
What's a trillion, do you think?
I don't know.
No, but it sounds good. All right, I'm going to put you out of your misery because I don't know what a trillion is. It's something like, and I mean, this is approximate, it's something like 1 followed by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 noughts. So it's something like that in a grain of sugar. And atoms are comparatively big to the world that quantum physicists are studying. Atoms are quite big things compared to the particles that make up atoms. Because when you look inside an atom, mostly it's empty space. It's like hugely empty. There's hardly anything there at all. There's just these tiny little particles whizzing around very, very fast. And they're several millions and millions of times smaller than that. Yeah? And that's the sort of thing that physicists are trying to study in this Large Hadron Collider. When you look at that level, one of the things that they starts to be questioned is whether those particles exist at all. One of the things that starts to be questioned is the very notion of objectively existing things. Because when you look for electrons, let's just take one of those subatomic particles, a famous one, an electron, that they're inside all atoms. When you look for an electron, it's not there unless you look for it. Or another way of thinking about it is that, well, quantum physics says that it's everywhere. An electron is more like an energy field spreading out across the whole universe. And then you try and look for it, and it suddenly pops into existence in one place. When you're not looking, it pops out again and spreads out across the whole universe as this somehow nebulous energy potential. So it's not obvious that we can talk in terms of objective matter being out there. Now, not all physicists would agree with that. Einstein hated that very notion, that there might not be an objective world. He hated that. And he spent the rest of his life, after quantum physics had sort of developed, trying to disprove it, trying to disprove quantum physics. He was one of the fathers of it, or grandfathers of it, but he hated it, because one of the implications of quantum physics was that maybe the world isn't really out there, sort of existing independent of us. When I was studying physics back in the 80s, most physicists still didn't know what to make of all of that, but they sort of, there was a standard interpretation of physics called the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics, and the Copenhagen interpretation said, yes, there's nothing objective out there, that the electron and all little bits of particle matter appear, they manifest when you interact with them. And when you don't interact with them, you can't definitely say that they're there at all. And what's more, they manifest sort of out of nowhere, because energy and matter, Einstein showed, were the same thing. So things can just appear out of nothing, as it were, and then disappear again. That's one of the weirdnesses of quantum physics. The other kind of weirdness is that particles that seem to be separate in space, like, there's an electron there and an electron here, and there's a couple of feet in between them. In the world of quantum physics, they can affect each other instantaneously, not just by sending a signal, but instantaneously they somehow can affect each other. Not all electrons, but you can get special pairs of electrons that you can separate out like that, and you touch one and the other one moves instantly. It's sort of as if you can't treat them as separate entities. There's just this thing called electron, and you can't say where it is, you can't say it's separate from something else, you can't even say if it exists at all. So that's really kind of weird, isn't it? That's really kind of weird, given that physicists were just thinking in terms of, let's look a little bit smaller, go down a little bit smaller with a bigger magnifying glass and see what we find. And what you find is this ghostly world that doesn't really exist. Now, what I find interesting is that Buddhism, the Buddha, taught something similar. Not in terms of electrons, obviously, and not using words like energy or something like that. What he said, though, was that the illusion of separateness and the illusion of thingness is a creation of our minds. That actually, out there are no things, and there's nothing that's completely separate. That it's better to think, or would be closer to think, in terms of processes. It's like the whole of reality is a set of processes that are constantly moving and changing and forming and overlapping. An analogy that I really like is think of an ocean. Think of this vast, an infinite expanse of ocean. And then think of whirlpools within that ocean. And a whirlpool is like a vortex of energy, isn't it? With waters being sucked down. And you can have different sizes of whirlpools, huge ones that could, capsize a ship, to tiny little eddies that are sort of spinning. And an analogy for what's going on is to say, well, those vortices and whirlpools are what we take to be things, like atoms, or like this table, or like me. But actually, it would be, when you look more closely, it would be more accurate to say that it's some sort of process, some sort of whirling form of energy that has temporarily condensed into some sort of shape and form. But it was never really separate from the rest of the ocean. You can't extract a whirlpool and say, here it is. Do you see what I mean? Or it was never that separate from another whirlpool, a neighbouring whirlpool. They affect each other. There are only forms of energy that are constantly taking shape and then reforming. So the Buddha didn't talk in terms of physics, but he did talk in terms of things not existing as we think they do. So maybe I'll come back to some of that later on. But the other thing I want to say about physics, and I think, it also applies to Buddhism, is that both are disciplines which rely on empirical evidence. So they rely on experience. They have theories, they have models, but those models and theories are only worth something if you can demonstrate them in experience. If you can't demonstrate that quantum physics, has these properties, or that atoms exist in this sort of number, in a grain of sugar, if you can't demonstrate that, then it's worthless. So physics is empirical. It requires evidence and demonstration. Similarly, Buddhism is empirical, in that the Buddha said there was a way out of human suffering, of existential suffering. But you don't have to believe that. You don't have to take it on trust. You have to actually experience it for yourself. And what Buddhism does is it provides methods for you to experience that truth of freedom from suffering. The joy, the bliss, the energy of escaping from our delusion. It provides methods for doing that, but those models are only useful if you put those methods into practice, and you can only do that for yourself. So in that sense, Buddhism is empirical, rather than taking a leap of faith. Do you see what I mean? There's no act of blind faith needed in Buddhism. At the same time, you need an open mind, because if you don't believe that the Buddha had anything useful to teach, then you wouldn't necessarily start down that path. So you have to have an open mind and say, okay, well, maybe there's something to learn here. Maybe meditation has something to teach me. Then you have to try it for yourself. And only if it starts to work for you do you have to, do you need to take the next step, as it were. Yeah, so it's empirical. So neither Buddhism nor physics, for example, require you to believe in a creator God that stands outside of creation, that somehow was the first thing, the first cause that caused all these atoms. Physics doesn't require you to believe that. Physics talks in terms of natural laws. the laws of gravity, the laws of electromagnetism, the laws of the atom and the quantum world, etc. Physics talks in terms of natural laws. Buddhism also talks in terms of natural laws. It says that this is the way things are. There are natural patterns governing the universe, and if we understand those patterns and we intelligently apply them to our lives, we can grow. We can grow and develop as human beings. But it doesn't require an external agency like a god to govern those laws. Yeah? You don't need a god to implement the law of gravity. But both physics and Buddhism requires an openness to our experience and a curiosity that doesn't make easy assumptions, that is open to the mysterious, rather than thinking that we know what's going on. Yeah. So one of the things that the Buddha said, or Buddhism says, is that there are no existent things out there, that all we've got is our experience. So right now you're looking at me, but you can't necessarily know anything about me apart from what you experience through your 5 senses and through your mind. You can't really know what I'm like independently of your experience of me. Or I can look at this leaf and I see that it's green, a pale kind of green, slightly yellowy. I can touch it and it feels quite dry and a little bit rough. But all of that is happening through my senses. Yeah? If I didn't use my senses or my mind, I wouldn't know what was out there. But more than that, I'm going to do that. Sorry, leaf. When you look at that leaf, it looks green, but green is just a perceptual experience that happens in your mind. There's no such thing as green, is there? We know that when you see green, what you're seeing is a wavelength of light that's bouncing off, entering your eyes, bouncing off the retina, going into your brain, being jiggled around, and then you see this as green. And if you're colourblind, then you might experience it as a different colour to what I experience it as. Yeah. We know that green isn't necessarily a property of the leaf. It's a property, somewhere it's to do with the leaf, but it's somehow, the experience is happening in our mind. Yeah? So what Buddhism is saying is that everything is like that. Everything's happening in our mind. Everything's happening in our mind. And if you think that it's all out there, then somehow you've lost your freedom. Whereas if you recognize that everything's happening in the mind, and then you work on developing your mind, changing your mind, transforming it, then your whole world changes. Your whole world changes. So kind of we know this, like if you were to take, not advocating this, but if you were to take some sort of recreational drug that changed your colour perceptions, you'd sort of suddenly realise, wouldn't you, that green isn't such a easy property to ascribe to the leaf. If you start to meditate, particularly if you go deeper into meditation, your perceptions change. I'm not saying that it's like an acid trip, but your perceptions change. They change, and your world changes. Literally, that's how it feels. So yes, I find it interesting that one interpretation of quantum physics is also saying that you can't say what's out there, there's an interaction going on, and Buddhism's definitely saying that. So I'm just going to read you something another physicist said. This was a guy called David Bohm, who was a sort of protege of Einstein. Bohm is one of the few physicists in the last century who's explored, well, he was a brilliant physicist, but he's also explored Eastern ideas about mind and consciousness. He was, well, on YouTube, for example, you can find clips of him in dialogue interviewing Krishnamurti, who was this Hindu teacher. This is what Bohm says. He says, reality is what we take to be true. What we take to be true is what we believe. What we believe is based upon our perceptions. What we perceive depends upon what we look for. What we look for depends upon what we think. What we think depends upon what we perceive. What we perceive determines what we believe. What we believe determines what we take to be true. What we take to be true is our reality. Isn't that brilliant? Isn't that just brilliant? This whole, in that, in those few sentences, sort of undercutting this notion that reality is something definitely existing, independent of our perceptions, independent of our thoughts and views, and what we take to be true. So I want to introduce you to a model that Buddhism uses to describe reality. And this is a model that Sangharakshita, my teacher, has particularly highlighted and expanded upon. So it's a model which I'm not going to be able to do justice to. I just want to briefly kind of run through. But see if you can follow it, and then I'll pause and we'll see if there are any questions. Okay. So it's a model that says that there are natural laws in the universe, that the universe is being governed by natural laws, that there aren't things out there. There are these processes, and these processes affect each other according to natural laws. Yeah. But what this model from Buddhism says is that those laws govern not only what we think of as matter, but they go much further. So I'm going to show you this model very briefly. And laws in Sanskrit translates the word niyama. So this is a model called the 5 niyamas, or the 5 categories of law. And by law, we mean natural laws, like the law of gravitation, not sort of laws that are imposed by a creator God or laws that are human in that sense. These are naturally existing laws. Can you all see this? I'll read them out anyway. The 5 niyamas. And you can classify these niyamas, these laws, under 5 headings. So I'm going to start at the bottom. So this law, this set of laws, is called the Utu niyama. And the Utu niyama is all those laws that govern matter, what we think of as inorganic matter, inanimate matter. Actually, in Buddhism, nothing's inanimate, but what we think of as inorganic matter. So they would include all the laws of physics. Now, as I say, the Buddha didn't know anything about physics, but he did say that matter was governed by natural laws. It would also include the laws of geology, inorganic chemistry, etc., etc. All of those laws, the law of gravity, the laws of quantum mechanics, etc., relativity, all form part of this Utu niyama. Now, physicists, a lot of them, think that that's all there is. If you explain these laws, they say you've explained everything. You've explained reality. Buddhism says, no, that's just the start. That's just the lowest level of laws governing our world. The next level is bija niyama. And this level of law comes into operation when matter starts to gather together in clumps that become complex enough for life to form. When life forms out of matter, other laws start to happen. So, like a plant has photosynthesis. There's a process going on there that can't be just explained in terms of quantum physics. There's laws of biology, there's laws of botany, and that's what bija niyama is all about. So I'm just going to write biology, but it could be organic chemistry, botany, etc. But then it says when those when life becomes complex enough in evolutionary terms, then something else emerges, and what emerges is what we call mind, or simple consciousness. And then there are another set of processes or laws that's come into operation according to this model. And they're governed by what are called the Manonema. They're called the Manonema. Mano meaning mind. And here, by mind, what's meant is instinctive mind. So simple kind of instincts that all animals have, we have too. So instincts for survival, instincts for food, instincts for sex and reproduction, instincts for sleep, things that you don't have to consciously kind of think about, that we are just instinctively born with. And those instincts can be really complex in some animals. So, you know, birds that migrate all the way south over thousands of miles in the winter, they're governed by instincts. They don't have to think about it. If they had to think about it, they'd never do it. So they're governed by instincts that are the Manonema. Yeah? So it's instinctive mind. Now, the Buddha wasn't particularly concerned about these three lower nemas. We've got them, so it's good to know about them, but he wasn't concerned about them. He was concerned about the next two. So the next one is said to arise, it's karma niyama, and it's said to arise when mind becomes complex enough to have self-consciousness. So human beings, and maybe some higher animals, are self-conscious in the sense that not only do they have instincts, but they can be aware that they're aware. They can think about themselves. They can reflect on themselves. They can have this reflexive kind of mind that knows itself. So I can think about, I wonder how I'm feeling now. Oh, I'm a bit grumpy. That's a reflexive self-consciousness. Yeah? I'm not, by the way, but... So when reflexive consciousness happens, a new set of laws comes into being, and they're called the karma niyama. And the karma niyama is this set of natural laws that are to do with what we call ethics. And put very, very simply, it says that when a self-reflexive, self-conscious being acts from generosity and kindness and awareness and love and altruism and energy, that the effects of that action tend to be positive. Positive in that they tend to lead towards greater happiness for oneself, but also for others. And then conversely, every time we act from greed and craving and hatred and unawareness, what we do is we trap our minds in a narrower prison, and that has a detrimental effect on our own consciousness and is likely to have a detrimental effect on others and the world around us. So the karma niyama is all about these natural laws, it's natural ethics about how you can move towards greater happiness. And meditation is working at this level, primarily. It's working at the karma niyama level, and a lot of Buddhist practice is working at the karma niyama level. And if you practice it, you start to change. You start to change your mind, that is, and it becomes brighter, more lucid, more clear, more positive, more kind, more courageous, more free, more expansive, and generally you experience the world in a happier way. That doesn't mean that bad things don't happen to you, but you experience life generally, even when bad things do happen, you can hold them. You experience life generally in a more positive way. Now, this model isn't saying that everything that happens to you is due to your karma, yeah? Because there are these other niyamas, including biology. So if you're ill, it doesn't necessarily mean it's your bad karma, because it could just be a biological thing. We all age, we all grow sick at times. But nevertheless, this ethical law affects our universe, affects our experience. We can't do much about the laws of physics or biology or instinct, but we can about how we act in the world. And this is what Buddhism is primarily concerned about. But it's concerned about something more than this. It's concerned about something more than this. Because Buddhism isn't just about trying to become ethically more pure or better, although that's part of what Buddhism's about. Buddhism's about something that goes beyond even being a very, very good, positive human being, happy, healthy human being. That's a real step, and not to be underestimated. And for most of us, we might spend a lifetime trying to become a bit more integrated, a bit more positive, a bit more kind, a bit more generous, etc., etc. And that's really worth doing. It leads to a real human life. But Buddhism says there's more. And this more is more difficult to talk about. What happens, though, is that at some point it's said that not only do you become kinder and more aware, but you start to lose this notion that you're a separate entity altogether. You start to lose this notion of a fixed and separate I, or a fixed and separate self. You start to experience yourself as a changing process in a universe of changing processes that's interacting with the whole of reality. Everything is interconnected. And you start to experience that in your own being. Normally, we think of me as being very special and separate, and you as being out there, don't we? And it's like all of us become a centre of our universe. And so what happens to me in my day is frankly the most important thing in the universe. And everything that happens to you is secondary to that. And we're all like that, aren't we? We're all like that. That my life, my experience is the most important thing. And that can't be how reality is. Frankly, there are bigger and more wonderful things out there, aren't there? It's not all about me. And this Dharma Niyama process starts to, in your experience, lead to transcendence. So it's the laws that lead to ultimate transcendence and liberation. So if you practice Buddhism, actually if you just practice meditation, you don't even need to think of yourself as a Buddhist. If you practice meditation, if you practice ethics, what starts to happen is your sense of self starts to change. And then you can get flashes of insight that this self that we think of as so fixed and unchanging isn't what we think of at all. It's a bit like a quantum physicist thinking, I'll go and look for the electron. And then when they look more closely, they realise it's a much more ghostly process rather than a thing that you can't grasp and that isn't separate from the rest of the universe. So that is what the Buddha was talking about when he talked about enlightenment. He says that this is what represents ultimate liberation. This Dharma Niyama process leads us away from this self-centeredness to something that's transcendent, where we don't really think in terms of separate entities at all. And if we could be like that all the time, we'd be free. We'd be free of all the self-imposed suffering that we normally impose on ourselves. Even death wouldn't mean the same thing. A whirlpool wouldn't sort of suddenly, it wouldn't think of itself as separate. So an ending of a whirlpool wouldn't be a death that we kind of normally conceive of. Life wouldn't be the same thing. Something much, much more mysterious would have entered our experience. Because it's so difficult to talk about, Buddhism often uses the language of symbols. And the Buddha image is a symbol of this mind that doesn't identify with self. And what's said to happen is that when you stop identifying with self, your experience changes into compassion. There is just this sense of love and compassion that pervades all of your world. And that is liberating, and ultimately what sort of all of us are craving, this complete fulfillment that we're craving. Okay, so I'm going to read you one more thing that Einstein said, and then I'm going to stop and we'll take questions for 5 to 10 minutes or so. So Einstein, he wasn't a Buddhist, but some of the things he said were very, very Buddhist. And he did say that of all the world religions, he thought that Buddhism was the one that came closest to reality. And here he's just talking about something that I think touches on what I've just been trying to illustrate by this Dharma Niyama process. And again, he uses the language of he, so I'm just going to read it as he says it. A human being is a part of a whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to the affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in all its beauty. Isn't that just brilliant? Let me just read that again, because I think it's just brilliant. A human being is part of a whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in all its beauty. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there with Einstein being Buddhist. And then let's see.